work started from an observation that the way in which consumers were researching and buying products was changing dramatically. The things that were driving this change were new technologies and media vehicles, the internet being the most important of those, but also an increase in consumer empowerment, that consumers, rather than sitting passively and having advertising come at them, they were much more actively reaching out to their friends and family, to the internet, to blog sites, to understand their options. Based on this, we felt there was a real need to step back and reevaluate both how consumers were going through their decision process and what, therefore, companies needed to concentrate on in order to make their marketing efforts most productive. For many years now, the common language around how to think about the step flow of marketing has been what people will call the purchase funnel. In other words, people became aware of a brand, then it moved into something they really consider, then they decide to try it, and then they would become loyal to the product. There are two things about this that don't work quite as well in our current environment. The first is that it's wide at the front and narrow at the end, i.e., people are aware of many brands and they slowly narrow that list down to where they become loyal. That doesn't quite describe how people actually go through the decision-making process. The second is that the funnel is by nature linear. It has steps that you go through in order. And what we were finding in the qualitative research that we did, that it was a much more circular process. We started with in-depth qualitative focus group research, and then we did a quantitative research in all three major geographies of the world, in 5 major consumer industries, talking to close to 20,000 people to develop this perspective. Let me give you an overview of how the consumer decision journey works. It starts with ongoing exposure. People see, they hear about brands. You then have a trigger of some sort where people start across the decision journey. They are now going to move towards purchase. The first stage is initial consideration. In many industries, people actually start in their initial consideration of a brand with a relatively narrow list. We believe because of the busy lives and the bombardment of media, it's just very difficult to get through all this clutter into the consumer's initial consideration set. However, once the consumer decides they're going to buy a product, they move into a stage that we called active evaluation. And it is here that the number of brands they are considering increases, which is exactly the opposite of the premise of the funnel, going from broad to narrow. This is the stage when the consumer is intent on purchasing and they are actively researching the product and the options they have for purchase. That could be going on the internet, really paying attention to ads that are on the TV, which they didn't before because they weren't in active evaluation. The third stage is closure, and this is the moment of purchase. For many products that sell in a retail environment, this is a critical moment. Many consumers, as they come into a store, still have not decided which brand they're going to buy. They make that decision in the store. The last stage is what we call the loyalty loop. One of the important points about this loyalty loop is this difference between active and passive loyalists. We've tended to talk about loyalty as a single dimension. People are loyal or they're not loyal. What we found in our research is there's 2 types of loyalty. There is active loyalty. That's the more traditional view of loyalty, where people really don't consider other brands when it comes time to repurchase a product. However, many more people had what we called passive loyalty, which are people who are open to buying that brand again, but are equally, if not more, open to consider other brands during the active evaluation phase. The most important thing for marketers to do is to make sure that their marketing activities are aligned against how their consumers research and buy products. There are 2 risks: wasting money and alienating consumers. When we have worked this through with companies, we have found typically there are 5 areas that they want to consider whether they have the right alignment or not. The first area is on where are they putting the priorities on marketing. An example, making a decision to spend less money on the closure part of the decision journey and spend more money on trying to improve either their initial consideration or their post-purchase experience, which has far greater leverage in terms of driving sales. The second is that companies need to look at their messaging in light of where they have the greatest opportunity. For example, companies' messaging is all about trying to get into the initial consideration set. And yet, when the consumer reaches out during their active evaluation stage, they're not providing the right facts and testimonials that the consumer is looking for. The third is most companies are going to have to make fundamental investments in what we would call consumer-driven marketing by vehicle, to make it easy for people to learn about how to use their products. Now we have things like internet sites, new ways to show products, technical manuals, testimonials from people that will make it easy for the consumer to get, but are also helpful, even fun. The fourth is winning in store. We have found that in many categories that the consumer is actually not making their final brand choice until they get in store. Making sure that the packaging is both appealing and informative is absolutely critical for that last-minute decision. And the fifth, aligning all of your customer-facing activities so that you provide a seamless brand experience for the consumer across their decision journey. Looking at the touch points that most influence a consumer. Now, by a touch point, I mean any way in which the consumer can learn more about the brand they're considering buying. That would include everything from talking to a friend to seeing some advertising to checking internet sites. And we analytically looked at which touch points were most influencing the consumer's decision. And what we found, 2 types, company-driven versus consumer-driven. And in consumer-driven, the consumer is reaching out to get information. They are talking to their friends, doing internet searches, seeing what's said on third-party sites. In the initial consideration, it was very much still company-driven. The advertising was a very critical part of the touch points that influenced the consumer. However, when we got into active evaluation, 2/3 of the influence of the most powerful touch points were from consumer-driven touch points. Word of mouth, talking to friends and family, searching on the internet. And that is a very big change. You need to develop ways for people to talk about your product so that word of mouth works, develop or be represented on independent internet sites where people will go and research and buy products. Because if you don't have enough presence on those types of consumer-driven approaches, when the consumer is reaching out during active evaluation, you're not there for them to find.